The call lasts 4 minutes and 31 seconds. A 17-year-old boy. A quiet Tuesday morning in October. He picks up the phone, dials 911, and begins describing what appears to be a break-in his family's home. His voice is steady, measured, oddly calm for someone who has just come home to find the back door forced open and his father nowhere to be found. The dispatcher asks him to stay on the line, to walk her through the house, room by room. He does. Kitchen, living room, his own bedroom, then the hallway. And then he stops. There is a pause on the recording that lasts 11 seconds. Not long, in the ordinary sense of time, but in the context of what comes next, those 11 seconds will be replayed by investigators, analysts, and a jury more times than anyone could count. Because what the boy finds in that hallway, what he describes haltingly to the dispatcher, in a voice that has shifted from calm to something else entirely, is not evidence of a break-in. It is evidence of something no one in that town had been looking for. The dispatcher later said that in 22 years on the job, she had never heard a silence quite like that one. What came after would unravel a family, rewrite years of community memory, and force a reckoning with a question investigators would return to again and again. How long had this been hiding in plain sight? Stay with me. Millhaven. Ohio is the kind of place that tends to get described by people who grew up there into completely different ways depending on how they left. Some remember it warmly, the kind of small city where everyone's parents knew each other, where high school football games drew full bleachers in October, where the same families had lived on the same streets for 3 and 4 generations. Others describe a place with a long memory and a short tolerance for anything that didn't fit its image of itself. Both descriptions are probably true. Most places like Millhaven are. Dennis Carver had lived there his entire life. He was 46 years old, a project manager at a regional construction firm, and by all visible accounts a stable, unremarkable presence in the community. He coached his son's little league team until the boy was 12. He attended church most Sundays. He kept his lawn edged, his driveway clean, and his opinion largely to himself at neighborhood gatherings. People described him, when later asked, with the same cluster of words: quiet, dependable, a little private, not unfriendly, just contained. His wife, Sandra Carver, had grown up 2 towns over. She and Dennis had met in their mid-20s, married within a year of meeting, and moved into the house on Alderman Road shortly after. Sandra worked part-time as a dental hygienist and was remembered by colleagues as warm, quick to laugh, and someone who deflected any conversation that veered toward her home life. Not defensively, people said, more like she was practiced at it, as though changing the subject was something she had gotten very good at over a long period of time. Their son, Tyler, was 17 at the time of the 911 call, a junior at Millhaven High School, average grades, a few close friends, no disciplinary record. He played bass guitar in a band that practiced in a friend's garage and never performed publicly. He was described by teachers as observant and reserved. One teacher, when interviewed later, used a specific phrase. She said Tyler seemed like someone who spent a lot of energy being invisible. That detail will matter. Sandra Carver had been missing for 11 days before Tyler made that call. Her disappearance had been reported to police on October 3rd, initially by Dennis himself, who said she had left for a weekend trip to visit her college roommate in Columbus and had not come home. He said he hadn't been immediately alarmed because Sandra sometimes extended her visits without much notice. He said he had called her several times and gone to voicemail. He said he assumed she needed space. The Columbus roommate, when contacted by police, said she had not seen or spoken to Sandra in over 4 months. Dennis, when confronted with this, did not appear surprised. He appeared, investigators would later note, almost as though he had been waiting for them to catch that particular thread. He adjusted his story without visible agitation. He said he must have been confused about which friend she had gone to see. He said Sandra had been struggling lately, that their marriage had been difficult, that she had spoken about needing to get away. He was cooperative. He was articulate. He provided a revised timeline without being asked twice. He did not cry during the interview. Investigators logged the inconsistency. They opened a missing persons case. They began the slow work of building a picture of Sandra Carver's last known movements. And then, 11 days later, Tyler came home from school to find the back door open. The last confirmed sighting of Sandra Carver was on the evening of September 30th. A neighbor, walking her dog at approximately 7:45 p.m., saw Sandra standing in the driveway of the Alderman Road house. The neighbor waved. Sandra waved back. The neighbor said Sandra looked tired. She said, when pressed, that she had actually considered stopping to say hello but hadn't, because she seemed. The neighbor searched for the word, braced, like someone standing very still because movement would make something worse. That description was noted. It was not, at that point, treated as significant. Neighbors see each other in passing all the time. People look tired. Dennis's timeline for the night of September 30th placed him at a work dinner until 9:30 p.m. He had a receipt. He had the testimony of a colleague who confirmed he was there. He was present and accounted for between 6 p.m. and 9:30 p.m. What happened before 6 o'clock and after 9:30 was less documented. Sandra's phone went silent at 8:17 p.m. on September 30th. The last signal placed it at the Alderman Road address. The phone was never recovered. Her car remained in the garage. Her purse, her everyday purse, the one she used for work, the one that contained her insurance card, and her lip balm, and the small photograph of Tyler she had carried since he was 5, was found in the kitchen. Her suitcase was missing. 2 changes of clothes were unaccounted for. This, Dennis pointed out when investigators did a walkthrough, supported his account of her leaving voluntarily. What he did not point out, and what investigators only identified later by pulling pharmacy records, was that Sandra's medication, a daily prescription she had taken for 8 years without interruption, had not been refilled. The last pickup was September 28th, a 30-day supply. It was still, nearly full, in the medicine cabinet. People who are leaving voluntarily take their medication. This was the first thread that felt genuinely wrong. The second came from Tyler. When investigators conducted a routine interview with him in the first week, Tyler said his mother had seemed upset in the days before she disappeared. He was careful with his words. He said she and his father had argued. He said it wasn't unusual. When asked to describe the argument, he paused for a long moment and said he hadn't really heard what it was about. He said he had been in his room with headphones on. The investigator conducting the interview, a detective named Rachel Assay, later noted in her report that Tyler's eye contact during this answer was different from his eye contact during every other answer. Not evasive, exactly. More like selective, like someone who had decided in advance where the edges of honesty were, and was being precise about staying just inside them. Assay flagged Tyler's interview. She recommended a follow-up. Before that follow-up could be scheduled, Tyler made his 911 call. It would be easy, and incomplete, to reduce Dennis Carver to a type. Investigators, prosecutors, and the journalists who covered the case afterward all struggled with the same tension. The evidence told one story about Dennis Carver, and nearly everyone who knew him told another, not because they were lying, but because the two things can coexist. This is something true crime coverage gets wrong often. The idea that a person who does a terrible thing must have been visibly terrible all along, that there must have been signs everyone missed, warnings that should have been obvious. Sometimes that is true, and sometimes the most accurate thing that can be said is that someone was genuinely ordinary in most of the ways people are ordinary, and genuinely capable of something devastating in a way they kept entirely sealed off. Dennis Carver appears to have been the second kind. The psychological evaluation conducted post-arrest identified several consistent traits: a high degree of emotional compartmentalization, an unusually developed ability to manage external presentation under stress, what one evaluator described as an almost architectural sense of self-control, a deep intolerance for perceived loss of status or authority within the domestic sphere, and beneath all of it, something that kept appearing in different forms across different parts of his history, a need for control that expressed itself not through overt aggression, but through the slow, patient removal of anyone's ability to see clearly. Sandra's friends, interviewed after her disappearance, described a pattern that had built over years. Sandra had grown less available, less present at social gatherings. She had stopped initiating plans. When she did attend events, she was warm but contained, which, they later acknowledged, they had mistaken for contentment. She had mentioned, once, to a close friend, that Dennis didn't like her being out late. She had mentioned it the way you mention a minor inconvenience. The friend had not thought to ask more questions. She had stopped visiting her family in the last 2 years. Her brother, who lived in Michigan, said that the last time he had seen her in person was Thanksgiving of the year before. She had called him periodically, but the calls were shorter than they used to be, and he always had the feeling she was not entirely alone when she made them. This kind of gradual narrowing is documented in the literature on coercive control. It does not typically announce itself. It progresses through small adjustments, a comment here, a preference asserted there, a subtle shift in who holds the authority to make decisions, until the perimeter of a person's life has been reduced to a size that is manageable. From the outside, it looks, very often, like a quiet marriage. Tyler, investigators would eventually understand, had grown up inside this architecture. He had learned its rules the way children learn the rules of any environment they cannot escape, completely, efficiently, and without fully naming what he was learning. He knew which subjects required headphones. He knew which moods meant the evening would be difficult. He knew how to be invisible. His teacher had used that word without knowing what it meant. When Detective Assay sat with Tyler's early interview and the 911 call recording side by side, she said something in his affect across both of them felt consistent in a way that made her uneasy. He was not performing shock. He was not performing confusion. He seemed, both times, like someone navigating a situation he had spent a long time preparing for without knowing exactly when it would arrive. The first officers on scene for Tyler's 911 call documented the back door, which had indeed been forced. One point of entry. No other obvious signs of intrusion. Nothing overtly disturbed inside the house. Tyler met them at the door. He was standing very still. He directed them to the hallway. The house on Alderman Road had 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a finished basement, and a small room off the main hallway that Dennis Carver had designated, for the entirety of Tyler's memory, as his home office. The door was always closed. Tyler had been told, from a young age, not to go in there. Not aggressively, not with a memorable prohibition. It had simply been established as a rule, the way households establish rules, and Tyler had followed it without thinking much about it. What Tyler had noticed that morning, coming home early from school with a headache, was that the door was open, not wide open, ajar. He said he almost walked past it. He said something about the angle of the light made him look twice. Inside the room, which the officers initially catalogued as a standard home office, desk, filing cabinet, computer, shelves, there was a closet. The closet was locked with a separate, newer lock that did not match the rest of the hardware in the house. Tyler told the officers he had never seen inside it. The officers, on the basis of the original call being a possible break-in, requested a check of the premises. Dennis Carver was not home. He had left for work at his usual time. He was at his desk at the construction firm when his cell phone rang. The locked closet required a warrant, which Detective Assay, who arrived within the hour after being notified about the open office door, moved quickly to obtain on the basis of the active missing persons case. She later said she was not certain what she expected to find. She said she had learned, over years of investigative work, not to anticipate, to observe. What the closet contained was not a body. What it contained, organized with a precision that investigators described as methodical, was documentation, folders, hard drives, a personal journal, handwritten, spanning approximately 4 years, photographs, financial records that were separate from any account Sandra or Tyler had known about, and, stored in a sealed container at the back of the lowest shelf, a collection of items that would only make sense once investigators had spent 3 weeks working backward through everything else. Among those items, Sandra's missing phone, powered off, intact. The picture that emerged from the closet's contents was not of an ordinary man who had committed a single terrible act. It was of someone who had been quietly constructing a parallel record of his own life for years, documenting, in his own hand, his perception of events, his grievances, his justifications. The journal was not confessional in tone. It was analytical. It read, investigators noted, like someone making a case for themselves to themselves, rehearsing arguments, logging incidents, building a private narrative in which every entry tilted toward a conclusion he appeared to have been moving toward for a long time. Whether the closet contents were intended to be hidden indefinitely, or whether some part of Dennis Carver had built himself a room he knew someone would eventually open, is a question that was never fully answered. Dennis Carver was brought in for questioning on the afternoon of October 14th. Less than 4 hours after the warrant was executed, he arrived voluntarily, with an attorney, and sat down across from Detective Assay with the same composed affect he had maintained throughout every prior interaction. He was dressed for work. He appeared unhurried. Assay spent the first 40 minutes of the interview discussing the closet at all. She asked him about Sandra's schedule, their daily routines, the state of their relationship in the months before her disappearance. She asked about Tyler. She asked about his job. She allowed the conversation to become almost comfortable. Later, she said this approach was deliberate. She wanted to observe how Dennis Carver managed a conversation he believed he was controlling. The answer, she said, was that he managed it very well. He was precise about facts. He acknowledged difficulties in the marriage without appearing damaged by them. He expressed appropriate concern for Sandra's welfare while maintaining his original characterization of her as someone who had left voluntarily. He was, she said, one of the more disciplined interview subjects she had encountered. Then she put the journal on the table. She did not explain it. She did not comment on its contents. She simply placed it in front of him and watched. There was a pause of approximately 7 seconds, and then Dennis Carver made a decision that his own attorney, sitting beside him, did not anticipate. He looked at the journal for those 7 seconds. Then he looked up at Assay, and he said, with a precision that investigators found remarkable given the circumstances, "I want to explain the context." He did not deny the journal was his. He did not deny the room. He did not deny the contents of the sealed container. What he attempted, for the next hour and 40 minutes, was to narrate those contents into a different shape, to present the private architecture of the past 4 years as evidence of his own suffering rather than Sandra's, to position the documentation as the record of a man overwhelmed, not a man planning. It did not hold. The phone recovered from the sealed container, once examined, contained the final text messages between Sandra and her brother, messages Dennis had claimed he was unaware of. It contained a draft text, never sent, that Sandra had written at 8:09 p.m. on September 30th, 8 minutes before her phone went silent. The draft was 3 sentences long. It was addressed to her brother. The content of those 3 sentences has not been made fully public, per the wishes of Sandra's family. What has been reported is that it confirmed she was afraid, that she knew what was coming, and that she had tried, in those final minutes, to reach someone. She hadn't sent it. Whether from hesitation, interruption, or something else, the draft stayed a draft. Sandra Carver's remains were located 12 days after Dennis's arrest, on a property he had managed professionally for a client who had been out of the country. The location had required specific knowledge to access. It had been chosen, the prosecution argued, with the same methodical deliberateness as everything else. Dennis Carver was charged with first-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, and evidence tampering. He entered a not guilty plea. After a trial that lasted 3 weeks, He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. He has not publicly spoken about the case since sentencing. Tyler Carver was 17 years old when he came home with a headache and an office door standing slightly open. He's in his early 20s now. He has given no public interviews. He chose not to read a victim impact statement at sentencing, which is his right. His mother's brother read a statement on behalf of the family that was, by all accounts, restrained and careful, not a performance of grief, but grief itself, quietly and precisely expressed. What Tyler knew, and when, and how long he had been managing the weight of partial knowledge inside a house that ran on enforced silence. These are not questions that have been answered publicly, and they may never be. What investigators observed, across every interaction with him, was a young man who had been shaped by a very specific kind of household, in ways that were hard to see from the outside and deeply legible once you knew what you were looking at. His decision to stay on the line with the dispatcher, his decision to walk her through the rooms, his decision to stop at the hallway, whether that was coincidence, instinct, or something else, the investigators who worked the case have offered different answers in different contexts. Detective Asay said once, in an interview about the case, that she did not believe coincidence was the right framework for what Tyler did that morning. She said the more accurate word, in her view, was readiness, that there are children who grow up in dangerous households and develop an almost cellular sensitivity to what is wrong, to what is hidden, to which doors should not be open, and which ones, one day, need to be. She said she hoped he was okay. She said she thought about that often. The question that lingers over cases like this one, and there are more of them than is comfortable to acknowledge, is not the question of how a person commits a terrible act. The evidence, the psychology, the pattern of behavior, those things, eventually, make a kind of terrible sense. The documentation exists. The analysis exists. The harder question is the one Sandra Carver's friend found herself returning to in the months after the trial. She had known Sandra for 15 years. She had seen her 2 or 3 times a year. She had noticed, in her own words, that something was off, and she had decided, each time, that it was not her place. She said she did not believe she could have saved Sandra. She may be right about that. Coercive control is not a problem that tends to yield to the awareness of friends alone, and the structural conditions that allow it to persist are systemic in ways that exceed any individual failure. But she said she had stopped using the phrase "not my place." She said it had become, for her, a phrase that deserved more scrutiny. The house on Alderman Road was sold 18 months after the trial. A family with 2 young children moved in. They repainted the hallway a color called soft linen. They put a different lock on the home office. The 911 call recording is used in training seminars for dispatchers in the state of Ohio. It is catalogued under the category of cases where the presenting emergency was not the actual emergency. 4 minutes and 31 seconds, 1 11-second pause, and a door that had been closed 4 years, standing just slightly open. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic abuse or coercive control, the National Domestic Violence Hotline can be reached at 1-800-799-7233 or by texting START to 88788. All contacts are confidential. Thank you for watching. If this stayed with you, it should.